The greatest revolution in human history was not political, but economic. It began in Britain, but reached its heights in America. I'm talking, of course, about the Industrial Revolution. The historian, Thomas Haskell, described the Industrial Revolution in America as the most profound and rapid alteration in the material conditions of life that human society has ever experienced. In the last quarter of the 19th century, America industrialized on a revolutionary scale. A furious expansion of railroad networks, fueled by government loans and land grants, opened a vast continental market. Interstate trade grew so rapidly that the American economy quadrupled in size between 1870 and 1905. American living standards doubled, and America transformed from an agricultural economy to an industrial one. It also transformed from a rural society to a metropolitan one. Just over half of American workers in 1880 worked on farms. By 1920, only 1/4 remained on the land. This social dislocation was so unprecedented that it required new words, such as urbanization, a term coined in Chicago in 1888 to describe the migration from farm to factory and the explosive growth of America's industrial cities. Even with the large-scale migration from farm to factory, industry's voracious demand for labour could not be met. Thus, the factories began relying on immigration, which began on a grand scale in the late 19th century. Between 1890 and 1914, 15 million immigrants arrived in the United States, and nearly 70% of the new arrivals were Catholics, Jews, and Orthodox Christians from Southern and Eastern Europe. Most congregated in the cities. In 1900, 3 out of 4 people in New York City, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco were immigrants. By 1910, the foreign-born accounted for 22% of the US labor force and 41% of non-farm laborers. At the turn of the 20th century, the philosopher and pedagogue John Dewey said, "There has never been a revolution in all history so rapid, so extensive, so complete." Did this revolution improve human life or degrade it? Is the Industrial Revolution something to be celebrated, or do we need an anti-industrial revolution? This video is going to interrogate these questions from 2 different angles. It will begin by looking at the new left philosopher, Herbert Marcuse, and his critique of industrial civilization. It will then outline Ayn Rand's critique of Marcuse and the anti-industrial revolution more broadly. Herbert Marcuse was born in 1898 to an upper-class Jewish family in Berlin. As a student, he participated in a failed socialist uprising, and with the rise of the Nazis, he fled to the United States. As Marcuse grew older, he began to question his socialist and Marxist beliefs. Whilst he remained committed to Marxism, he argued that Marx needed to be re-examined and reconstructed. Marxist theory at the time was focused on material matters. Members of the Soviet Union argued that their economic system provided greater material comfort and a higher standard of living. Marcuse came to believe that this was a misunderstanding of Marxism. Marxism was not just about material comforts, it was about a totally different way of life, one less focused on materialism.
In the development of Marxian theory, not in Marx himself, but in the development of his theory, socialism has become, the concept has almost entirely been focused on a more rational, larger development of the productive forces, on an ever higher productivity of labor, on a more rational distribution of the product, instead of stressing that a socialist society, as Marx envisaged it, at least the younger Marx envisaged it, was a society qualitatively different from all preceding societies. Now, in what way qualitatively different? The main point, I would say, is for Marx, a genuine socialist society was a society in which the quality of life was decidedly different from the existing societies. Meaning, in a genuine socialist society, labor full-time alienated labor would no longer be the measure of wealth and value. In an authentic socialist society, men and women could live their life without fear, without being compelled to spend their entirely adult existence in alienated performances. This image has been obscured, and the result was some kind of frightening continuity between the developed and advanced capitalist societies and the image of a socialist society.
Yes, socialism began to become like its enemy, so to speak.
Exactly.
I know from your writings that you...
Much like Heidegger, Marcuse believed that Moscow and Washington had come to resemble one another. This is because they had both embraced industrialism. In One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse argued that industrialism is totalitarian. He explained what he meant by this in an interview in 1964.
And we're going to be discussing Dr. Marcuse's book, One-Dimensional Man. And this is a book, as I understand it, which is about the United States, and its general thesis is that in certain significant ways we have reached a situation, or are reaching a situation, which is extremely close to a totalitarian society. And I think we'll begin by discussing what precisely we mean by this. And I want to quote from Dr. Marcuse's book. You write, "By virtue of the way it has organized its technological base, contemporary industrial society tends to be totalitarian. For totalitarian is not only a terroristic political coordination of society, but also a non-terroristic economic technical coordination, which operates through the manipulation of needs by vested interests. It thus precludes the emergence of an effective opposition against the whole. Not only a specific form of government or party rule makes for totalitarianism, but also a specific system of production and distribution, which may well be compatible with a pluralism of parties, newspapers, countervailing powers, etc." And I wonder if you'd begin by telling us precisely what you mean, in this sense, by totalitarian.
By totalitarian, I mean the constellation or situation in which the private as well as public existence of man, of the individual, is controlled, is exposed to standardized, required ways of behavior, standardized imposed values, standardized imposed needs. This can be done by a private as well as by a public bureaucracy. It can be done via the perfectly democratic media of mass communication and so on. It is in a way a consequence, as the quote shows, of technical progress, which implies mass production and mass distribution. Mass production and mass distribution in turn require a considerable degree of standardization, a considerable degree of the submission of the individual to pre-given and superimposed values, ideas, aspirations, goals, and so on.
In other words, people in societies based upon mass production and consumption, whether they be communist or capitalist, become reflections of the products they consume, which is to say, standardized, homogenized, and dispensable. Marcuse believed that a socialist society would be something totally different to this. It would be a society that rejected a culture of consumption. These ideas profoundly influenced the student movement of the 60s and 70s. The polemics and placards of campus revolutionaries, whether they were in Paris or Woodstock, frequently featured quotes from Marcuse.
Recently, wherever they had a riot in Europe, they had the riots in Rome, and Marcuse showed up. They had the riots in Paris when the French had to bring out the troops in the tanks. Marcuse was there. When they had the riots with the students in Berlin, Marcuse was there.
The New Left movement that Marcuse inspired promoted collectivism, mysticism, and a return to nature. It declared that the West was corrupt and that its influence had to be eliminated through a renunciation of technology. They exhorted people to give up their automobiles and shopping centers, their air conditioners and nuclear power plants, They proclaim the superiority of nature over technology, feelings over reason, of faith over knowledge, of leisure over production, and of spiritual concerns over material comforts. This was the distinguishing characteristic of the New Left. Unlike the Old Left, it did not wear an Apollonian mask, which is to say, it did not make appeals to science and reason. It was overtly Dionysian. Ayn Rand emigrated to America only a few years before Marcuse. She was born in communist Russia to a bourgeois Jewish family. She left for America in the 1920s. Marcuse and Rand became popular around the same time, but for very different reasons. Marcuse was, as has already been said, the philosophical leader of the New Left. Rand saw this movement as regressive, rather than progressive. Indeed, she wrote a book attacking the New Left entitled The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. In this book, Rand argued that the New Left was seeking to enshrine a new age of primitivism. Primitive, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, means of or belonging to the first age, period, or stage, pertaining to early times. With respect to human development, primitivism is a pre-rational stage of development. It is a stage in which man lives in fearful awe of a universe he cannot understand. It is also a stage in which the tribe, rather than the individual, is primary. All thought processes and activities were communal, rather than individual. In other words, the tribal mind was so gripped by supernatural and magical outlooks, by group rituals and customs, as to preclude any genuine individuality. To truly appreciate this point, we must turn to the work of the anthropologist Sir James George Frazer. In 1890, Frazer published a wide-ranging comparative study of religion and mythology entitled The Golden Bough. This book was ignored or dismissed by most academic anthropologists in the second half of the 20th century, but there has been a renewed interest in the book and a belated acknowledgement that much of its content is based on sound anthropological observations. In The Golden Bough, Frazer argues that tribal societies are best conceptualized as totalitarian democracies, which is to say, members of tribal society are totally controlled by the custom and tradition of their group. To quote Frazer, "No human being is so hidebound by custom and tradition as your democratic savage. In no state of society, consequently, is progress so slow and difficult. The old notion that the savage is the freest of mankind is the reverse of the truth. He is a slave, not indeed to a visible master, but to the past, to the spirits of his dead forefathers, who haunt his steps from birth to death, and rule him with a rod of iron. He yields a blind, unquestioning obedience to unwritten law. The least possible scope is thus afforded to superior talent to change old customs for the better. The ablest man is dragged down by the weakest and dullest, who necessarily sets the standard, since he cannot rise, while the other can fall. The surface of such a society presents a uniform dead level, so far as it is humanly possible to reduce the natural inequalities, the immeasurable real differences of inborn capacity and temper, to a false and superficial appearance of equality." Put differently, the tribal society has no place for human individuality, because the individual is totally subsumed by the group. Anyone who demonstrates any intelligence or independence of mind is dragged down by the tribe. Frazer believes this is a form of despotism more absolute than any we can imagine in the modern world. To quote him once again, "For after all, there is more liberty in the best sense, liberty to think our own thoughts and to fashion our own destinies, under the most absolute despotism, the most grinding tyranny, than under the apparent freedom of savage life, where the individual's lot is cast from cradle to grave in the iron mould of hereditary custom." Many historians claim that the first stirrings of true individual consciousness were asserted in the golden age of ancient Greece. Socrates and other philosophers defied taboos and the decrees of the gods, and began to give expression to ideals of inner goodness, truth, and sacred conscience. So threatening to traditional values did such new convictions prove that even the open-minded Athenians forced Socrates to drink the hemlock. But the principles of individuality that Socrates promoted did not die with him. Philosophers and scientists throughout European history have defied hereditary custom in the name of truth. The conflict between the individual and the collective has gone on throughout history. Ayn Rand characterizes this conflict as a fight between two Greek gods, Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo was the Greek god of light. Nietzsche calls him the god of individuation and just boundaries. He creates boundaries between individuals and ideas. He separates objects from each other and from nature. He separates the individual from the tribe. He represents reason, civilization, and order. Dionysus, by contrast, represents the oneness of nature. He dissolves the boundaries that exist between people and things. Dionysian passion leads man to melt, merge, and dissolve into a mob or tribe. He represents passion, destruction, and unbound energy. Rand believed that the conflict between Apollo and Dionysus was the fundamental conflict of her age. In 1969, shortly after the launching of Apollo 11 and the Woodstock Music Festival, she gave a lecture entitled Apollo and Dionysus, where she discussed this fundamental conflict.
On July 16, 1969, 1 million people from all over the country converged on Cape Kennedy, Florida, to witness the launching of Apollo 11 that carried astronauts to the moon. On August 15th, 300,000 people from all over the country converged on Bethel, New York, near the town of Woodstock, to witness a rock music festival. These two events were news, not philosophical theory. These were facts of our actual existence, the kind of facts, according to both modern philosophers and practical businessmen, that philosophy has nothing to do with. But if one cares to understand the meaning of these two events, to grasp their roots and their consequences, one will understand the power of philosophy and learn to recognize the specific forms in which philosophical abstractions appear in our actual existence. The issue in this case is the alleged dichotomy of reason versus emotion. This dichotomy has been presented in many variants in the history of philosophy, but its most colorfully eloquent statement was given by Friedrich Nietzsche. In The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Nietzsche claims that he observed two opposite elements in Greek tragedies which he saw as metaphysical principles inherent in the nature of reality. He named them after two Greek gods, Apollo, the god of light, and Dionysus, the god of wine. Apollo, in Nietzsche's metaphysics, is the symbol of beauty, order, wisdom, efficacy, though Nietzsche equivocates about this last. That is the symbol of reason. Dionysus is the symbol of drunkenness, or rather Nietzsche cites drunkenness as his identification of what Dionysus stands for: wild primeval feelings, orgiastic joy, the dark, the savage, the unintelligible element in man, that is the symbol of emotion. Apollo, according to Nietzsche, is a necessary element, but an unreliable and thus inferior guide to existence that gives man a superficial view of reality, the illusion of an orderly universe. Dionysus is the free, unfettered spirit that offers man, by means of a mysterious intuition induced by wine and drugs, a more profound vision of a different kind of reality, and is thus the superior. And indicating that Nietzsche knew clearly what he was talking about, even though he chose to express it in a safely, drunkenly Dionysian manner, Apollo represents the principle of individuality, while Dionysus leads man, quote, into complete self-forgetfulness, unquote, and into merging with the oneness of nature. Those who, at a superficial reading, take Nietzsche to be an advocate of individualism, please note. This much is true. Reason is the faculty of an individual to be exercised individually. and it is only dark, irrational emotions obliterating his mind that can enable a man to melt, merge, and dissolve into a mob or a tribe. If you want to know fully what the conflict of reason versus irrational emotion means, in fact, in reality, on Earth, keep these two events in mind. It means Apollo 11 versus the Woodstock Festival. Remember also that you are asked to make a choice between these two, and that the whole weight of today's culture is being used to push you to the side of and into the mud of Woodstock. In my article, Apollo 11, in The Objectivist, September 1969, I discussed the meaning and the greatness of the moon landing. Quote, "No one could doubt that we had seen an achievement of man in his capacity as a rational being, an achievement of reason, of logic, of mathematics, of total dedication to the absolutism of reality. The most confirmed evader in a worldwide audience could not escape the fact that no feelings, wishes, urges, instincts, or lucky conditioning could have achieved this incomparable feat, that we were watching the embodied concretization of a single faculty of man, his rationality." Close quote. This was the meaning and motive of the overwhelming worldwide response to Apollo 11, whether the cheering crowds knew it consciously or not, and most of them did not. It was the response of people starved for the sight of an achievement, for a vision of man the hero.
Rand contrasted this Apollonian vision with the Woodstock Music Festival and hippie movement more broadly. Like the old left, they were collectivists. They emphasized the collective over the individual. But unlike the old left, they did not champion reason, science, and technology. Instead, they claimed that feelings were superior to reason and nature superior to technology. They were, in other words, completely Dionysian.
There are two significant aspects in this new left switch of the collectivist line. One is the open break with the intellect, the dropping of the mask of intellectuality worn by the old left, the substitution of birds, bees, and beauty, nature's beauty, for the pseudoscientific super-technological paraphernalia of Marx's economic determinism. A more ludicrous shrinking of a movement's stature or a more obvious confession of intellectual bankruptcy could not be invented in fiction. The other significant aspect is the reason behind this switch. The switch represents an open admission by Soviet Russia and its facsimiles around the world and its sympathizers of every political sort and shade that collectivism is an industrial and technological failure, that collectivism cannot produce. Instead of their old promises that collectivism would create universal abundance and their denunciations of capitalism for creating poverty, they are now denouncing capitalism for creating abundance. Instead of promising comfort and security for everyone, they are now denouncing people for being comfortable and secure. They are still struggling, however, to inculcate guilt and fear. These have always been their psychological tools. Only, instead of exhorting you to feel guilty of exploiting the poor, they are now exhorting you to feel guilty of exploiting land, air, and water. Instead of threatening you with a bloody rebellion of the disinherited masses, they are now trying, like witch doctors addressing a tribe of savages, to scare you out of your wits with thunderously vague threats of an unknowable cosmic cataclysm, threats which cannot be checked, verified, or proved.
In other words, Rand believed that the hippies and the New Left movement were opposed to the material and intellectual advances created by Western civilization. She believed that their emphasis on nature was enshrining a new age of primitivism. She saw this not only in their celebration of nature, but also in their celebration of multiculturalism. To quote her article, The Age of Envy, published in The Objectivist in 1971, "It is primitive cultures that we are asked to study, to appreciate, and to respect. Any sort of culture except our own. A piece of pottery, copied from generation to generation, is held up to us as an achievement. A plastic cup is not. A bear skin is an achievement. Synthetic fiber is not. An ox cart is an achievement. An aeroplane is not. Stonehenge is an achievement. The Empire State Building is not. Black magic is an achievement. The work of Aristotle is not." Why is Western civilization admonished to admire primitive cultures? Because they are not admirable. Why is primitive man exhorted to ignore Western achievements? Because they are. Put differently, Rand saw the environmentalism and multiculturalism of her time as regressive rather than progressive. The New Left were not pushing the culture forward, but pulling it back into a more primitive way of life. Nietzsche expressed a very similar idea in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, in which he said, "Who can give any guarantee that modern democracy, the even more modern anarchism, and indeed the predilection for the commune, the most primitive form of social structure which is common to all Europe's socialists, are not in essence a huge throwback?" I am much more critical of industrial civilization than Ayn Rand. I believe that industry has caused some of the greatest problems that we face today, and I believe that industrial civilization must be radically reformed. But I am not convinced that it should or even could be completely destroyed. Any society that deindustrialized would simply be conquered and colonized by a country that remained industrial. We cannot therefore return to a pre-industrial mode of living, even if we wanted to. One either embraces modernity or becomes colonized by an industrial power. Zulu spears were no match for British rifles, no matter how brave individual warriors were. Similarly, the superiority of American naval guns were decisive in persuading the Japanese that they had no choice but to open up their country and accept foreign competition. The Japanese realized that the only way they could retain their sovereignty was by absorbing the latest technology. Any country that wishes to preserve its autonomy must embrace technological civilization and the social structures that support it. They must, in other words, embrace mass production, urbanization, and a division of labor. Many on the right have become critical of modernity because they recognize that urbanization, mass production, and the division of labor undermine traditional social groups like tribes, clans, artisans, extended families, and religions. They believe that tradition can only be preserved by returning to pre-industrial ways of living. I believe this is a mistake. You do not preserve your traditions and autonomy by rejecting modernity. When the Japanese were first confronted by American naval power, they realized that their autonomy and traditions were in grave danger. They did not confront this danger by retreating into the past. Instead, they totally transformed their society. Under the slogan "Rich Country, Strong Army," the new leadership of Japan replaced old temple schools with a system of compulsory education administered by the state, recruited a mass peasant army in place of the samurai warriors, and established national taxation, banking, and currency systems. Japan embraced Western technology because it did not want to lose its national independence to European colonialism, as China had done. In order to keep things the same, they changed everything. In other words, they adopted a dialectical view of modernity. I believe the right should also adopt a dialectical view of modernity. It should not retreat into the comforts of the past, but should instead embrace modernity. A modernity that is not at odds with tradition, but instead inseparable from it. Our task is to try and articulate what that might look like. Thanks for watching.